All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Benjamin, and welcome to a slightly different video. Like I said, I found a really cool historical figure that I really want to talk about, and you know what? I'm going to talk about him. And uh, before I get into it, we'll be back to my normal content on Friday, and I'll probably do my swing state analysis tomorrow, just to keep everything on pace. Um, but today we're going to talk about how a Pole saved the American Revolution. And that may be a slight exaggeration, but I'll let everyone in the comments be the ones to describe that. And that person is Tadeusz Kościuszko. And if I mispronounced his name, I am sorry. I do not speak Polish. I know a few phrases, but that's about it. He was raised, of course, in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which actually probably deserves its own video and maybe even series of videos. It was a rather interesting nation that existed and had some very interesting politics. Um, he joined their Corps of Cadets, which was their equivalent of a military academy, and it was set up by their king at the time, Stanislav. Um, and he later left during their Bar Confederacy uprising that occurred to actually remove King Stanislav from power because he was too controlled by the Russians. And so he left because of. Uh, he left to actually study in Paris, and he couldn't get into a military college in Paris because he was not French. But he did have to leave Poland because one of his family members, his brother, was serving or actually fighting on behalf of the rebels. And because the Corps of Cadets was sponsored by the monarchy, he couldn't remain because his loyalties would be, well, tested. And then with some family issues, specifically the fact he tried to get married to his employer's daughter and was savagely beaten by that man's retainers, as well as some financial issues within his own immediate family. He decided to travel to to America, also because he had heard about the American Revolution and wanted to help out, because he had, while in France, become a man of the Enlightenment and a man of republicanism. And during the American Revolution, he got into Philadelphia on August 30th of 1776 and was granted a commission and assigned to the Continental Army on the very next day, and on August 31st. And specifically, his skills as an architect wound up putting him in what would probably be the best described as the forerunner for the Army Corps of Engineers. And his first assignment was actually in 1777, first true assignment, where he was sent to Fort Ticonderoga, which was at the time one of the most formidable fortresses in America. And it had been held by the Continentals ever since it was taken in 1776 by Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold. And of course, Henry Knox took the cannons all the way from Ticonderoga to Boston. But his job there was to evaluate the fortifications, evaluate the defensive position, and make any alterations. And he recommended that a bluff above the fort above Ticonderoga be fortified and have cannon emplacements put there. And his idea was to prevent the British from taking the fort and establishing the high ground so they could take the fort. The commander of the fort disagreed and said nothing needed to be done. This is Fort Ticonderoga. An aware commander will not let his opponent take the high ground. Well, General Burgoyne wound up taking the high ground and forcing the force at Ticonderoga to retreat. And part of this retreat was, well, they needed to make some ground on the British in order to meet up with General Horatio Gates, or else the entire New York campaign could be lost. And actually, by the time they met up with Gates, they did have to make even further retreats, or else that army specifically would be destroyed by the pincer movement of Burgoyne, and I believe it was General Howe. It was either General Howe or General Clinton. I don't remember which. But thankfully, Kościuszko was a good engineer, and Gates put him in charge of delaying the British. And instead of what a military commander would do, what your average military commander would do, which is send out skirmishers, send out military forces at the expense of your own body, or at the expense of your own envoy and your whole host, you would send a few out to just delay your opponent's, catching up and engaging you in battle. Kościuszko, on the other hand, decided to save men, and he did what every engineer would do, which is he felled trees blocking roads, he dammed up rivers, he destroyed bridges, river crossings. Basically, he used the terrain to his advantage, and he made it extremely hard for the Brits to fully supply their army in a reasonable way by slowing down their baggage trains. And thus, you would slow down their army. Again, it's how an engineer would look at the problem is, well, an army marches on its stomach, so we need to slow down the food. And so he did. Now we move on to Saratoga. Now, General Horatio Gates selected Kościuszko to scout the New York countryside for the most defensible position, and then to fortify it. And he chose Saratoga, specifically Bemis Heights overlooking the Hudson. And as we all know, it was basically impossible for the Brits to take any of the American positions at Saratoga, partially because of the very skilled fortifications, but also because of the American commanders' unwillingness to engage in an open battle. Until Benedict Arnold decided to be extremely insubordinate and win the battle and take glory from Horatio Gates, who managed to steal it right back, adding another blemish on Benedict Arnold's career for basically having credit, not necessarily stolen from him, but not given to him for actions he took. And probably contributed to Benedict Arnold being a traitor, but we'll get to Benedict Arnold in just a bit. Also, the American commander's willingness to use sharpshooters. That was also extremely important in Saratoga. And now Saratoga is considered one of the most important battles of the Revolution for a lot of reasons. First, General Burgoyne surrendered his entire army at Saratoga, meaning that the war moved from New England and the mid-Atlantic states further south into Pennsylvania, Virginia, the Carolinas, and even a little bit into Georgia. But it also was the battle that said that the Americans could compete with the British on an actual field. And that was the battle that brought the French and later the Spanish into the war. And there's a very good chance that without the fortifications, Gates may have had to retreat. Arnold wouldn't have been attacking from a position of strength. And lastly, Kościuszko's actions in delaying the British so that they had time to properly fortify Saratoga was instrumental in the victory. So you could say that one of the most important battles, the outcome was decided by one person, and that person wasn't a commander of battlefield forces, but was an engineer. Now, that may be an overly simplistic way of looking at it, but it's impossible to say that Tadeusz Kościuszko was unimportant in this campaign, let alone this battle. He was instrumental. But giving him credit for saving the revolution, as in my title, may be a bit clickbaity. But Gates did give credit where credit was due in this regard. He said of the battle to his friend Dr. Benjamin Rush, who is also a very interesting person and deserves a video, the great tacticians of the campaign were the hills and the forests, which a young Polish engineer was skillful enough to select for my encampment. Yeah. Good general always loves his engineers. Time to move on to West Point, because Kościuszko spent 2 years designing and reworking the existing fortifications at the U.S. Army Fort at West Point, which is now the U.S. Military Academy. And his design was regarded as extremely innovative and was definitely praised. And these were the fortifications that Benedict Arnold tried to hand over to the British. And, of course, the story of why Benedict Arnold became a traitor is, well, it's a very interesting one. But that's beyond the scope of this video. Anyway, Kościuszko requested a transfer to combat duty in 1780, and George Washington granted it. And Kościuszko once again served under Horatio Gates in the South. And now we talk about the Southern Campaign, and specifically towards the end of the Southern Campaign. And he was, again, instrumental in the North Carolina campaign, specifically the race to the Dan River in Virginia, where the Continental Army would be able to meet up with another force, regroup, and then launch a reconquest of North Carolina in the backcountry. And Kościuszko, again, filled the role as an engineer. And by this point, General Nathaniel Greene had replaced Horatio Gates, and Greene chose to keep the pole because he recognized the talent, both from his limited service on the battlefield, but also for his service as an engineer. And Nathaniel Greene liked to fight a very mobile war. He didn't like large forces that would be tied down to their baggage trains. He preferred a force that could sustainably live off the land. And he preferred to fight small skirmishes and small battles that would have as many advantages in his favor as possible, so that he would minimize his own casualties while maximizing the enemy's. Look at Cowpens for a good example, or Guilford Courthouse for a great example, which I'll talk about in just a second. But Kościuszko, once again, his goal was to see the Continentals reach the Dan River as quickly as possible and cross it. And the way he did that was he scouted ahead, he gathered intelligence, he did what an engineer would do, which is find the most efficient, least taxing route through the countryside. Anyway, moving on. And he was the one who selected where Nathaniel Greene would fight for what became known as the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. And while the Americans suffered a battlefield defeat and a tactical defeat at that battle, this essentially rendered General Cornwallis and his army combat ineffective, because the fighting ability of that army was just reduced completely, and that's why he traveled all the way up to Yorktown, because he was trying to get relief from the sea and trying to meet up with a relief army. Which, as we all know, didn't happen, because the French had somehow managed to defeat the British in the sea battle, and a combined French and American siege of Yorktown occurred. And Yorktown is a battle that probably deserves its own video too. Now, during the reconquest of South Carolina, Kościuszko suffered his only injury in this war at the Second Battle of Camden. And like any good engineer, he was supervising approach trenches to the fortifications of the British at Camden. And he was probably surveying the approach trenches or turning to actually point and give orders, because his injury doesn't make sense otherwise, because it was an American victory and there was no retreat. And he was definitely not a coward, as we'll see later on in his military career. Because his injury was a bayonet in the buttocks, as most sources will claim. So, yeah. Now, here's the thing. Up until 1784, he didn't receive any pay for his service in the United States military. Now, he was promised $12,000 at 6%, starting January 1st, 1784, as well as if he chose to settle in the United States, he was given the rights to 500 acres of land, which is really good. Depending on where you are, that 500 acres of land could be worth a ton. It's worth about where I live. It's worth about $500,000. So that's a lot of money for 7 years of service. $500,000, that works out to a little under about, I would say, if I'm doing my math correctly, maybe 84,000 a year, which is fitting for a mid to high level officer in the U.S. military. So, yeah. But he instead, even though he was naturalized as an American citizen at this point, he decided to return to Poland. Because, well, home sweet home, right? So, we're going to talk a little bit about the Great Sejm of 1788 and 1789, as well as his starting of his military service in Poland. Because his story didn't end with the American Revolution, and he's actually going to return to America at some point. He had actually been denied multiple commissions on multiple occasions in Poland due to, well, we'll say political reasons, as well as Russian influence in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, but he was finally granted the commission of a major general in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in 1789 by King Stanisław, and they immediately started paying him. And by the way, this would end his any financial problems him or his family held. He started being paid a very large amount of, at the time it was 12,000 zloty a year. Now, inflation is a thing, and it's hard to exactly quantify what that would translate into today, but it'd be well in the 100,000s, especially now considering that Poland uses the euro rather than the zloty. But it was a lot of money, basically. And part of his family's financial problems were familial mismanagement of their own property and financial resources, as well as the U.S. government's failure to be able to pay out on any promises, on any promissory notes. And this is a common phenomenon with Revolutionary War veterans, is that they basically never got paid. A lot did eventually get a pittance, but it was... Yeah, Revolutionary War veterans didn't get a lot of money. And he supported the Constitution, the Polish Constitution that was ratified by the Sejm on May 3rd, 1791. However, Russia was not too happy about that. And so you had the Polish-Russian War, and sorry about not capitalizing Russia, but I am not ashamed of failing to capitalize it. Anyway, the Constitution was not approved of by outside powers, especially Russia, who invaded Poland in 1792. And the prince, one of the princes of Poland, was the commander-in-chief of the Polish forces, and he had recognized Kościuszko's military brilliance and had actually put him as second in command. And he served with distinction throughout the Polish-Russian War, though at first he was only held in reserve or put into rearguard actions. But he did, when he was transferred to guarding the flanks of the main Polish force, he served with distinction at the Battle of Dubienka, where he successfully held off a Russian force that outnumbered his 5-1. He did have to withdraw from the battlefield, but he did score a tactical victory. However, for various reasons, Polish King Stanislav surrendered, despite the capable actions of the various Polish commanders and their men, including Kościuszko, who were able to fend off a much larger Russian force. The Russian army that initially invaded Poland was about 100,000, and Polish levies at the time were at around 37,000. It depends on the source what the exact numbers are, but we can estimate that Polish forces were outnumbered between 3 and 4 to 1. After the war, he had to go on the move because at the end of the day, he was an extremely prominent Pole who had fought against the Russians, and Russia had even more power in Poland at the time and was about to partition Poland for a second time with Prussia. And he wound up dodging arrest by the Russians throughout. Whether he was in Warsaw or Krakow or Łódź or Lviv, it didn't matter. He was kind of on the run, and the Austrians even eventually joined in on the fun of trying to arrest Kościuszko. But before they tried to arrest him, they tried to give him a high military office because they recognized his strength as a commander. However, Kościuszko was a proud Pole, and he was not going to serve in the military of a nation that had participated in partitioning of Poland. And he tried to gain support in the revolutionary French government for help in restoring Polish sovereignty to former Polish lands that had been partitioned. But eventually he realized that the French weren't going to help, and he started becoming a little disillusioned with with revolutionary France because of the Reign of Terror. And then he heard about the Second Partition of Poland. And he staged his own uprising, which bears his name. And he was given the title of Naczelnik for the Polish forces, which just means commander-in-chief. And he managed to gather very quickly an army of 6,000 and marched on Warsaw. And he led a major victory at Raciowicz, and he personally led an infantry charge of some scythe infantry, peasant corps. And if you've wondered why I haven't included written down certain names or words, it's because of that L with the cross in it, which I had to just copy paste and edit the font to get it correct. Similar to how I did with his surname Kościuszko, but that one's a little bit easier. Though after many months of campaigning, which he was mostly successful in, though Poland was probably going to wind up losing anyway, they were still going to fight. He was eventually wounded and captured at Maciejowicz. Yeah, Maciejowicz. Or Maciejowicz. Yeah, Maciejowicz. I'm still unsure how to pronounce some of these words. And he was imprisoned at St. Petersburg in Russia. And after he left, the uprising was crushed at the Battle of Praga, where, unfortunately, the Russians decided to later massacre at least 20,000 Poles. So, yeah. And he remained imprisoned for the rest of Catherine the Great's rule. And then Poland was partitioned a third time, essentially wiping it off the map. Actually, effectively wiping it off the map. Though, in the words of Poland, jeszcze Polska nie zginęła. He was released from prison in 1796 and pardoned by Paul I, Tsar Paul I, after he was forced to proclaim loyalty to the Russian control and the Third Partition. He was also given 12,000 rubles, which, after he renounced his claim of oath of loyalty, Kościuszko actually tried to be a man of integrity and return the sum of money that he was given by the Tsar. He then headed for the United States through Sweden and Great Britain, and he probably could have claimed his 500 acres at this point. Though by 1797, he received news that Napoleon was marching with Polish forces in his cohorts, and that two of Kościuszko's own nephews were serving within the Polish corps of the French imperial of the Napoleonic armies. And actually, by this time, Kościuszko had become friends with Thomas Jefferson, the Vice President of the United States, whom Kościuszko listed as his executor of his estate in the United States, along with a will. And I'm going to kind of digress a little bit and talk about Kościuszko's American will, which basically said that all assets in America that Kościuszko controlled were to be liquidated to purchase the freedom for enslaved persons. Unfortunately, Jefferson, by the time Kościuszko died, Jefferson was also extremely old, and claimed that because of extreme age and ill health, he was unable to properly execute the will, and referred to it referred the will to another person who was more sympathetic to Kościuszko's desire for emancipation. In addition, and by the way, this is not saying that Kościuszko owned slaves, because he never did. He wanted to use it to purchase the freedom for others, for people who were enslaved, right? So he was an abolitionist in the purest sense. But and his will actually made it to the Supreme Court on a number of occasions, but nothing ever came of it, it's a little depressing if you think about it. And it is depressing. But anyway, back to Europe. While he wanted to originally serve in command, Jefferson wanted him to be a diplomatic envoy to France, partially due to the Alien Sedition Acts, which made Kościuszko a little bit suspicious of a suspicious figure to the ruling Federalist Party, but also due to tensions rising between the United States and France. Jefferson saw Kościuszko as a capable diplomat and somebody who could maybe speak to Napoleon. And he was offered command of the Polish legions in the French military because he was a capable military commander and an intelligent one at that, and a brilliant engineer. And he was unsuccessful in swaying Napoleon to properly establish Polish sovereignty. And that was actually Kościuszko's main goal in France, was to get Napoleon to properly restore the sovereignty of Poland. Napoleon, on the other hand, had really only established the Duchy of Warsaw as a launching point for his invasion of Russia. And that it wasn't really all that sovereign, or after the Napoleonic Wars, assuming Napoleon was successful, it was extremely unlikely that the Duchy of Warsaw would be durable in any way, shape, or form. And Napoleon and Kościuszko did not view each other amiably. They were not friends with each other. Napoleon stating that Kościuszko was of low intelligence, which is clearly not the case. And Kościuszko thinking Napoleon full of himself. And after the fall of Napoleon, Kościuszko met with Tsar Alexander in Paris, and then eventually in Switzerland. And Tsar Alexander offered the creation of a new Polish state from Polish-held lands in the Russian Empire. But Kościuszko declined to help form it or establish it or run it, because it would be a Russian puppet, and the borders and sovereignty, like I said, it would be a Russian puppet, but the borders especially were actually smaller than those of Napoleon's Duchy of Warsaw. And Kościuszko regarded it as, quote, a joke. Yeah. And of course, his later years, he eventually decided to live in Switzerland for the rest of his life. He tried to emancipate is probably not the most accurate word for it, but he did have serfs working on his estates in now Russia, but Poland. And he tried to effectively free them from working the land. But Tsar Alexander disallowed this, because of course he did. And he died in 1817. And is typically regarded as a hero for those who know of him here in the States, typically regarded as a hero. In Poland, Lithuania, and Belarusia, he is regarded favorably as well. Now, there have been many, many, many things named after him. There was a Polish infantry group named after Kościuszko. There have been various fighter aircraft wings named after him, including the Polish-American Kościuszko fighter wing from the Polish-Soviet War, where Americans volunteered to help Poland fight against the Soviet Union. Even back in the 1920s, we were fighting communism. He is referenced in the Polish national anthem, along with Napoleon, interestingly. Maybe ironically, too. But his story is kind of the it's kind of the embodiment of kind of that Enlightenment era thinking, that spirit of republicanism and nationalism. To an extent, there was an embodiment of nationalism. There's republicanism for sure. He was a die-hard advocate for Republican-style government. And when I'm talking about Republican-style government, I'm talking about a representative democracy, not a political party. And in general, he's one of the cooler figures I've come across studying history. And I felt that he warranted a video for those who are unfamiliar of him. Anyway, I want to thank everyone for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I'll see you next time. Take it easy. Have a nice day.